Joe told her captors she'd kill every single one of them before they got the chance to kill her. Episode 4, Murder Hornets, is where we finally start finding out whether that was a promise or just a woman buying herself time. This episode pulls double duty. It's a hunt to find Joe before it's too late, and it's the moment Joe's own plan to smoke out a Russian infiltration network actually starts detonating. Both stories are racing toward each other at the same time, and by the end of the hour, it's clear neither one is going to end quietly. So let's break down everything that happens in Lioness Season 3, Episode 4. This is a full breakdown of Lioness Season 3, Episode 4, Murder Hornets ahead. If you haven't watched it yet, this is your last chance to turn back. Joe set a trap for a hive of Russian assets. The problem is Hornets don't wait around to be caught. The episode opens with a room full of the people running this entire operation: Meade, Mullins, Westfield, Holler, and Mason, sitting down together to talk through the absolute worst version of how this could go. That's a heavy way to open an hour, and it tells you immediately that whatever contingency they're discussing isn't hypothetical anymore. It's close. Given everything we already know about how deeply compromised parts of the system are, a scene like this isn't just about finding Joe. It's about figuring out how much damage control the agency can survive if this operation goes sideways in front of the wrong audience. When you put 5 senior people from 5 different corners of the operation in one room to talk worst-case scenario, you're telling the audience that the stakes have officially outgrown any one person's ability to manage them. This is the part of the episode that's genuinely unsettling once you sit with it. If Joe stays missing long enough, or if there's any real risk she could be broken and forced to give up operational secrets, the conversation in that situation room almost certainly drifts toward the unthinkable, whether it's better for the country if Joe is recovered alive or whether her death is actually the safer outcome for national security. That's an enormous shift in how we're used to seeing this show frame its stake. Up until now, every threat to Joe has been about protecting her. The episode opens with this episode raises the possibility that the very people responsible for bringing her home might also be the ones calculating whether bringing her home is even the right call anymore. If that tension gets voiced directly, even briefly, it reframes the entire rescue mission. Joe isn't just racing her captor's clock, she may be racing her own government's patience too. Here's a detail worth circling back to, because it recontextualizes everything from earlier in the season. It's increasingly likely that Joe's own plan of publicly announcing that the CIA has a Russian agent in custody, while quietly using Olksandra as bait to draw out other infiltrators, actually worked exactly as designed, at least partially. If that's true, it would explain something that's felt strange since the season started. Why would someone as careful as Joe let herself become exposed enough to be taken off a public street? The uncomfortable answer might be that she didn't let her guard down by accident. She may have known this was a real possibility and gone along with the operation anyway, because forcing herself into the crosshairs was the fastest way to get the infiltration network to reveal itself. That's either the bravest or the most reckless decision Joe's made all season, and possibly both at once. If this kind of scene-by-scene digging is what keeps you watching, subscribe to Movie Break and turn on notifications. We're covering every episode of Lioness Season 3 the moment it dropped. She didn't get caught, she let herself get caught. Those are very different problems for the people trying to save her. With official channels compromised at multiple levels, Cruz, Kyle, and the rest of the QRF unit are effectively operating in the dark this episode, unable to fully trust their own chain of command while racing to locate Joe before her captors decide she's outlived her usefulness. That kind of operational isolation puts enormous pressure on a small handful of people who normally rely on a much larger support structure. It also raises the stakes of every decision they make, because a mistake made without institutional backup doesn't just risk the mission, it risks getting someone killed with no safety net behind them. Given how deliberately paced and psychologically brutal Joe's captivity has been shown to be, the show seems to be building toward a genuine question of whether the team even reaches her in time, rather than treating her rescue as a foregone conclusion. This is also where Cruz's arc from earlier in the season starts to feel especially relevant again. She spent episode 2 quietly wondering whether trained operators like herself were becoming obsolete against cheaper, faster technology, and now she's in a situation where the technology isn't the obstacle at all. It's institutional distrust, the very human problem of not knowing which of her own superiors to believe. That's a different kind of battlefield than the one she trained for, and watching her navigate it without the usual support of a fully trusted chain of command says a lot about how much this season has already reshaped what her job actually requires of her. The pressure at home hasn't let up either. Joe's daughters have already asked her to walk away from the CIA entirely after everything the family has been put through, and Neil has had to fully accept that his wife's job isn't something that can be kept at arm's length from their household anymore. That request from the girls lands very differently once you consider what's happening to Joe in the present timeline. If she survives this episode, she comes home to a family that has already on some level decided the cost of her career has become too high for them to keep paying. That's a brutal position for any parent to be in, surviving the mission only to find out survival didn't automatically buy back their trust or their sense of safety. It's worth paying close attention to how the burden of this crisis gets distributed among the senior characters, because it isn't falling evenly. Caitlin, having already signed off on the strategy of using Olksandra as bait, now has to live with the possibility that her own plan is directly responsible for Joe being taken in the first place. That's an enormous enormous weight to carry into a situation room full of people asking whether the woman she authorized to be exposed is now worth risking further resources to save. Meanwhile, Byron's earlier confrontation with the Russian ambassador means he's the one who has to answer for how aggressively the CIA has already escalated this conflict, and whether that escalation is what's keeping Joe alive right now or what's making her more valuable as leverage. Watching these two operate under that kind of pressure, each carrying a piece of responsibility for how this crisis unfolded, adds a layer of institutional guilt to an episode that could have easily stayed purely tactical. One of the more interesting ideas baked into this episode is the notion that figuring out who the enemy actually is might be a bigger obstacle than actually stopping them once identified. That tracks with everything building since the murder hornets concept was introduced. This isn't a single mastermind running a single operation. It's a scattered network of compromised people across multiple institutions, some of whom may not even fully understand how deep their own involvement runs. Joe's strategy of forcing panic through public exposure only works if the panic actually produces visible reaction. If some of these infiltrators are disciplined enough to sit still and do nothing, the entire plan risks stalling out, leaving the team no closer to finding Joe and no closer to rooting out the network that put her there in the first place. It's also worth taking seriously the possibility that Joe's entire strategy blows up in the team's face rather than paying off. Provoking a hidden network into action is a gamble built on the assumption that you can control what happens once they start moving, and there's very little in this season so far to suggest anyone involved has that kind of control. If even one of the exposed infiltrators decides that the safest move is to escalate rather than retreat, that could put more people in danger than just Joe, and it could hand the network justification to strike back harder than anyone on Joe's team anticipated. Given how high the body count already is this season, that's not a small risk to be taking with a plan built mostly on hope that panic makes people sloppy rather than dangerous. Murder Hornets earns its title by refusing to let any single storyline feel resolved by the credit. Joe's fate in captivity is still genuinely uncertain. The government's willingness to sacrifice her for the sake of operational security is now openly on the table in a way it never was before. And her own family has already started drafting the terms of an ultimatum she may not survive long enough to actually respond to. What makes this episode work isn't a single big action set piece. It's the accumulation of pressure from every direction at once, political, tactical, and personal, all converging on one woman who may have walked into this trap on purpose. If the show follows through on that idea, it turns Joe from a victim of circumstance into someone who gambled everything on a plan that isn't guaranteed to pay off. And that's a far more compelling place for this character to be than simply another kidnapping victim waiting to be rescued. There's also something worth noting about how the show is using its ensemble this episode. Rather than centering everything on Joe directly, since she's physically removed from most of the action, the hour spreads its tension across the Situation Room, the QRF team's search, and the McNamara household, letting each storyline carry its own version of the same underlying dread. That structural choice keeps the episode from feeling like it's simply marking time until Joe gets found, and it reinforces the idea that this crisis was never really about one person to begin with. Everyone connected to Joe, from her own daughters to the senior officials debating her fate, is now living inside the consequences of a plan she may have set in motion, knowing exactly what it could cost. That framing also does something clever for the show's long-term storytelling. By this point in the season, Lioness has stopped treating any single character's decision as isolated. Joe's choice to let herself become exposed ripples outward into Caitlin's guilt, Byron's political calculations, Cruz's growing disillusionment with the job, and Neil's mounting resentment at home, all in the space of one episode. That kind of narrative density is hard to sustain without losing clarity, but Murder Hornets manages to keep every thread legible even while cutting between them rapidly. It's a testament to how much groundwork the first 3 episodes did establishing exactly who these people are and what they each stand to lose, because none of this would land with the same weight if the audience hadn't already spent 3 hours understanding the cost each character is carrying into this one. Whatever comes next, this episode has made it clear that there's no version of a rescue that comes without a price attached, and that price is already being paid by people who never set foot near the room where Joe is being held. That's the full review of Lioness Season 3, Episode 4. Let me know in the comments whether you think Joe deliberately let herself get taken, how far you think the government is actually willing to go if her rescue doesn't happen fast enough, and whether you think Caitlin's plan was worth the cost it's already extracted from everyone around Joe. Subscribe to Movie Break so you catch the Episode 5 review the moment it's live. Thanks for watching.